I actually rewatched it before I wrote this review because I didn't want to get stuff wrong and kind of be out of place, because usually I write them right as I'm or after I'm watching. It's usually not writing well, because if I was writing it well, I would lose the point of the show. Anyway, so I was like, did a quick write up. I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on this episode, but we'll dive into it really quickly. So we'll start with a quick summary of this episode. Basically, this episode was just parts of the 5 fights leading up to Deku and Kachan versus All Might. So first there was the conclusion of Uraraka and Aoyama versus 13, following last week's big reveal. I don't know why I took a second to stumble over that, but after that we got Kirishima and Ishido versus the Principal, Jiro and Koda versus Present Mike, Hagakure and Shoji versus Snipe, and then finally Mineta and Sero versus Midnight. Some things I liked the scenes from the observation room. I, at the beginning of this arc, said this was something I would be interested in seeing the execution of. So far it's worked out really well. It adds much needed character interaction. There's not enough of it in the series, in my opinion. Just small character moments like this where they're just talking, observing things, playing the role of what the viewer thinks kind of thing. But in this episode, it actually served 2 purposes that were actually important to the storyline. One, it allowed for a little bit of follow-up on the Uraraka storyline that's going to be I'm not trying to spoil anything here, but it's going to be a recurring theme as it goes on. I think that's kind of obvious even for people who have no familiarity with the manga, but it's kind of obvious that was just going to be a lingering storyline going forward. And it also helps build up a little bit more hype toward the big fight that is coming up with Deku and Kachan versus All Might. So 2 purposes that actually really served important on top of just nice character interaction. I like these scenes a lot. Another thing I really liked about this episode was the cinematography. The environments were really important in this episode, and I just thought that they looked really good. Also, I'll talk about it in just a second, actually, but I really like the animation for this episode, too. I thought it was actually really well done. But environments, they play a strong part in this episode just because every fight takes place in a very distinct and developed environment. So having them all look really good, really fleshed out, was incredibly important in a way that it really isn't for a lot of other episodes. Even the best episodes of the entire series usually take place in 1 to 2 big environments that have been developed over the course of 2 or 3 episodes, and they're usually not the focal point of a scene. But in this case, it was a big part of every fight. So it was important to have them look really good, and they look fantastic. Another thing I really liked the Koda and Jiro versus Present Mike fight. I don't really have like a super particularly strong opinion on the other fights, but I thought this fight itself was stellar, and I would go so far as to say that this was a peak from this arc as a visual standpoint. The fight itself went about as one would expect, but the way it's portrayed is what elevates it to the next level for me. Animation-wise, this is fantastic. I don't think there's an argument. This was the best animated scene of the entire arc, or sequence of the entire arc. There were so many things that had to go right for this to be a very good, very well animated scene, and it went better than I even could have expected. Everything was really well done about this fight, and I don't think that could be said about any of the other fights, because either A, they weren't long enough, or B, we'll talk about this later, but one of them dragged on a little bit too long. But visually, this was an amazing sequence, and I actually really think that this is probably going to be what we take away from this as the most memorable scene in this episode. The final thing I liked was the final scene. It was really subtle. There wasn't like any dialogue. It was just a couple looks, and it set up really well for the next episode. It was inevitable that the final fight would get its own episode. I don't think there's a doubt about that. Main character, main rival, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of reasons we could go over, but actually, the way it was set up, it just didn't feel like it was like an unnecessary hype machine where there wasn't like some huge argument between Deku and Bakugo before the fight. There was no like, oh, Deku, I fucking hate you, I'm gonna kick your ass, blah, 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 whatever. There was none of that. It was just a stare. It was subtle. It was perfect, and it set up really well for the next episode. The one thing I didn't like about this episode is, well, there's a couple of things I didn't like that are a little bit more minor. One, this isn't a super memorable episode. That's something I'll talk about after this. This is my main problem with this episode. The pacing was incredibly puzzling. Much like episode 35, they rushed through, maybe not rushed, rush isn't the right word. They breezed through the fights a little too quickly just to focus on the last fight. This was a little bit less extreme because the fight against Present Might got a little bit more attention. The other fights were really rushed, but those two, I would say, got the most attention. This last fight, though, with Mineta and Sero versus Midnight, particularly, I think was done maybe not the greatest. And this is what I said when I don't have a super strong opinion on this fight itself, but I think that this final sequence just felt stretched out and a little bit inorganic. I'm not opposed to giving Mineta a huge moment. Everybody in the series, it's one of the things that I really like about this series. They give big moments to minor characters, but so I'm not opposed to that, but they seem like they just took what could have been said very quickly, very swiftly, and built it up into something that was just stretched out because they needed something to fill 5 minutes or 3 minutes. It wasn't really actually that long, but it just felt like it could have been much shorter, and I felt that threw off the pacing a little bit. It isn't a big complaint, like I said. It's kind of like a small potatoes thing, but it definitely took away from the episode in the end. I feel like it was just, they stretched it out too much. They made it much bigger of a deal than it had to be. I get the whole everybody has to have a reason to be hero thing, blah blah. I get all the points of why it was the main climax of the episode, but at the same time, I just don't feel that it was really necessary. That's just my opinion, though. Overall, I would make the argument that this was the weakest episode of the series so far, but it met the expectations that I had for it. The problem was it wasn't a super memorable episode. I wasn't anticipating a huge, important episode with super compelling and memorable moments, though. So, it's whatever. Ultimately, this episode added not a whole lot to the series narrative. It gave you an idea of kind of where everybody stood as students and what to expect out of them going forward. Like I said, it doesn't add a whole lot to the narrative, but for what it was, this was still a really good episode. I'll call it a 6, but that isn't a slight of it by any stretch. So what am I looking forward to next episode? It doesn't really need to be said, but I'm looking forward to the fight. Normally the idea of a Bakugo origin episode would not be super enticing to me, but after how good the last origin episode was, it was the best episode of the entire series and maybe even modern shonen anime, I would be interested to see how they weave the backstory into the fight itself. It was done very well with Todoroki. We'll see how they do it with Bakugo. I think the change in format to consecutive fights was a great call, and this fight will probably be the greatest beneficiary. Episode 23 sets a really high bar for this episode, and we'll see if it can live up to it. And so that's going to do it, episode 36. Like I said, I didn't have a whole lot of thoughts on this. I actually probably kind of rambled in a couple spots, which I tend to do, but that really not a whole lot to unpack about this for me. It was a good episode, but it wasn't a super great episode, and it's just one that is going to be memorable for the 2 or 3 big moments that it had rather than just being like an all-around quality episode. And I think ultimately probably the biggest thing that this episode is going to be remembered for is starting the whole Uraraka crush storyline, for better or for worse, because I know that's a maybe not controversial storyline, but it's one that people definitely don't really care about a whole lot. But we could spend 4 days talking about that. I have a lot of thoughts on that, and I'll save that for a different time. But anyway, that's going to do it for me. Let me know what you guys thought about this episode down below. Did you like it? Did you not like it? What were some things that you thought were standouts that I might have skipped over? Did you agree? Did you disagree with my opinion? And what did you just think of the episode in general? And what are you looking forward to tomorrow? Big episode inbound. There's going to be a lot to unpack. So see you tomorrow. We'll talk about episode 38, which is, I actually think, called Katsubi Bakugo Origin. I don't 100% remember because I watched the episode like an hour ago now. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned for more My Hero Academia.